Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to today's session. My name is Amy Banco, and I will be the facilitator for today's learning community on cultural humility and cultural responsiveness. We are looking at today's topic of supporting neurodiverse individuals in our programs and services. We are, as a gentle reminder, recording today's session. So please be mindful that what you put in the chat, what we'll be reading, discussions that we have, those items will be recorded throughout our session. Today's webinar is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. And this session is especially designed for FCS providers in mind. This is an interactive training, and we encourage everyone to utilize the chat feature as well as the Q&A to engage throughout the session. You will be receiving the PowerPoint slides, handouts, and other materials, including the recording from today's session through email, probably by tomorrow, if not Thursday. Again, just a gentle reminder that we are recording and that we are in a webinar format, so you will not have access to cameras. You probably don't have access to your microphones either, so please feel free to use that chat as we go throughout today's session. In terms of the usage of artificial intelligence for our learning community, we just want to make a note that any automated note-taking bots or similar tools during the Washington learning community events need prior approval. Unauthorized use of tools such as AI bots, note-taking bots, recording bots will be removed from the session. We want to try and maintain the privacy and confidentiality of attendees, especially times when we are doing activities where we pause the recording and ask for participants to share their experiences, thoughts, opinions on certain topics during the session. And a gentle reminder that I share with all of the attendees for the sessions that I facilitate. When we think about our virtual space today, I just want to put a gentle reminder out there of some community guidelines. These guidelines are just a gentle reminder of how we can best utilize this virtual space. And some of those guidelines include the following. I believe in co-learning. I firmly believe that we all are coming here in our virtual space with skills, knowledge, competencies, and we can all learn from one another in this space today. We ask that we lead with curiosity for today's session, to be open to hearing from other participants. And of course, as we're sharing, we are doing so in a stigma-free, discrimination-free perspective. And thinking about our group for today, I see some introductions coming in to the chat. Awesome, so please go ahead and continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. Share where you're coming from, what program you work in, a little bit about me. Again, my name is Amy Banco, and I am a faculty member at Rutgers University within the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. I am a licensed counselor. My current PhD program, I have a specialization in the treatment of trauma and counseling education and supervision. My master's degree is in rehabilitation counseling, which is a specific type of counseling focused on disability, disability justice, social justice. And my area of expertise really looks at what I call occupational and educational justice, helping people with disabilities, predominantly mental health conditions, right? Psychiatric disabilities. to have equity and inclusion in spaces that they may have historically been marginalized from accessing, things like post-secondary education, employment. I am someone who identifies as neurodiverse. And so this is a particular cultural lens for me and for my family. And it's an area that I am particularly passionate about when it comes to disability justice, helping people to have equal opportunities, equity, and access to meaningful roles in the community, the removal and mitigation of barriers to participation in society, free from discrimination, prejudice, where people with all different types of abilities, mental health conditions, or other medical conditions can thrive and again access meaningful life roles like student and worker. So I see so many of you are coming in from amazing program modalities in the state of Washington. Fabulous. I see some peer providers, some case managers, program managers, a lot of individuals coming in from Spokane, individuals coming in from the State Department. Great to have you here. Ah, fabulous. Such a wonderful wide representation of individuals that are providing services, overseeing and supervising services. It is great to have you all here today in our shared passion of supporting individuals who are part of the neurodiverse community. It's great to have you. So thinking about our topic, what brought us here in this virtual space, we are looking at the following objectives. We are going to define neurodiversity and explore, we're going to really narrow it down. Neurodiversity has so many different medical conditions, health conditions that can fall under that umbrella. And so for today's session, we're really narrowing it down to looking at this piece of autism and autism spectrum disorder and that comorbidity of mental health conditions. This is a population that is ever increasing from my state, the state of New Jersey, but also across the nation. And so I think we have to be very mindful as providers and practitioners when we see a group that is continuing to grow. How are we evolving to meet those needs, the unique needs of this community? We're going to look at identifying barriers and facilitators for success for individuals with autism. And we're also going to look at some strategies specific to one support intervention, which is accommodations. Developing accommodations for individuals who identify as having mental health conditions and autism. Just a bit about language. You're going to hear me throughout, and we're going to get into this in a little more detail in a second, but I do want to preface the start of my session with this piece about verbiage and linguistics. There are two different approaches to verbiage when it comes to the autism community: person first language and identity first language. And you will hear me today use those terms interchangeably. So you'll hear me use identity first language, autistic individuals, autistic people, autistic person. And you'll also hear me use person first language, individuals with autism. We're going to get into that in a little bit more detail, but I just want you to be aware at the start, you will hear me switching back and forth. People have different preferences. And so I use that until I know when I'm working with a person what their preference is, and I mirror that preference. Okay, so when we are thinking about today's topic and we hear this term neurodiversity, I want to know what comes to mind for folks. When you hear this term neurodiversity, what comes to mind for you? You can put in the chat. Okay. Normal, autism, ADHD, different ways of seeing the world. Megan, communication capacity and the variance in that, thinking and processing information differently, different types of brains. Brain works differently from Jeanette. Yes, my brilliant son, my favorite person. Oh, that's beautiful. Difference in ways the brain works. Autism, Asperger's, think and process information differently, a different way of processing and reacting to the world. PTSD. Yes, you guys are hitting so many key points. A variance, Liz, a difference from the norm, right? There's this variation from the norm, as some might say. Person with different process, non-conformal. Yes, neurodiversity involves a smorgasbord of communication styles, ability, processing, sensory experiences. Beautiful. Well said. Different ways of seeing and interpreting and acting on experience in the environment from Rachel. Yes, how the brain is processing and responding and interacting with that environment and all that beautiful variation. Yes, Q. Um, Individuals, autistic adults, overwhelmingly show preference for identity first language. Um, you personally describe yourself as autistic. You take offense when you describe yourself as autistic, and in the same conversation when someone calls you a person with autism. Thank you so much for that disclosure and that vulnerability and disclosing and sharing with us your experience and your preferences. There is a very strong leaning towards identity first language, and that comes with the autistic pride movement. Very, very much ingrained in this positive disability identity. And you'll see people lean that way for sure. Yes, yes, yes. Um, Large spectrum of cognitive, emotional, sensory processing and capability experiences. Simone, thank you. Found out normal in dictionary by the end of it. The okay, Annette. Moving beyond the yes, moving beyond the false concept of normal. This notion that life is to be experienced in one way only, and that if there is a variation from that, then there is some type of um, deficit or impairment, right, Liz? Thank you. Yeah, the importance to mirror the preference of who you're talking to. Don't be afraid to call me autistic if I do first. Absolutely. I love that. I love that statement, right? We have to mirror a person's language. Absolutely. You guys are hitting the nail on the head, so to speak. When we think about neurodiversity, this term was coined by the Australian sociologist Judy Signer in the late 1990s, who this individual herself identified as being autistic and introduced the term to advocate for the recognition of neurological differences, natural variations, natural variations within the human population rather than deficits, pathology, or disorder. Neurodiversity encompasses the idea that neurological differences, such as those associated with autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's syndrome, right? These are natural spectrums of human diversity. And instead of viewing these differences, again, as inherently negative or as pathology, neurodiversity emphasizes the value of diverse neurological profiles. When really, when we think about neurodiversity, there's this advocacy piece, right? It's not just this term to describe an experience, it also signifies this advocacy movement for acceptance, not just awareness, but acceptance, and a push for ways to remove societal barriers through accommodations and support for individuals with neurodiverse conditions, right? When we think about neurodiversity, this advocacy movement really gained momentum through the work of autistic self-advocates such as Jim Sinclair and organizations like Autism Network International. These advocates really promoted the idea that neurological differences should be recognized and respected, and they advocated for the rights and inclusions of neurodiverse individuals in society, right? So when we think about neurodiversity, it really encompasses this piece about social justice, right? Disability justice, acknowledging, again, variation in the experience of cognition. My son, who also identifies as autistic, um, loves to cite this one particular book and evolving research that believes that autism is the next evolution of the human brain and body. Um, and so there is this person-centered, strength-based approach when we think of the term neurodiversity. So again, we're going to really tunnel down in terms of that umbrella, looking specifically more at autism spectrum disorder and the comorbidity of mental health conditions as we proceed throughout today's session. So when we think about ASD, this was first described by Leo Kanner in the 1940s, who noted that children had differences in socialization and what he observed as insistence on sameness, right? Resistance, in his words, of resistance to change with repetitive behaviors. It took nearly 40 years for autism to gain official recognition as a diagnosis in the medical community. And in the 1980s, autistic disorder was added to the DSM-3, right? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Conditions or Mental Disorders. And we've seen a diagnostic evolution since then. Definitions of autism have broadened over time with the DSM-4 in the 1990s to introduce the concept of a spectrum with subtypes, including Asperger's disorder, which has since been removed, right? Thinking about the DSM-5 and the current diagnostic criteria, we see two core domains of symptoms, which they emphasize as social communication needs or impairments or deficits, and restricted repetitive behaviors. And that's what individuals are looking at for a diagnosis. And that was replacing the DSM-3's older triad of social interaction, communication, and behavioral symptoms, right? So now we have this kind of two-domain model instead of this triadic model in the DSM-5. We know that autism in terms of prevalence in the US has increased dramatically in the past few decades. We see from the 1970s to 1990s, it was kind of considered rare. By 2000, the estimated prevalence increased to 1 in 150 children. And this climbed to 1 in 44, according to the CDC, by 2018. According to the 2020 reports from the CDC, in terms of their surveillance data, we see a reported 1 in 36 children. So that's approximately around 3% identified with ASD. And, there are a lot of theories about this increase in terms of the prevalence of ASD. And we see that, for some experts, they attribute it to expanding diagnostic criteria, greater awareness and screening, improved identification across groups and communities of kids. We also see, in terms of these additional counter theories, that autism is a natural variation and potentially the next evolution for humans, right? When we think about diagnostic criteria, that's a very medical model, right? They're looking at symptomology, they're looking at things like, putting it very much in terms of like deficits, impairments, pathology, right? Symptom clustering, right? In terms of the social and communication criteria. There's a heavy emphasis on symptoms. And when we may be formally trained as practitioners, this may be this, is often our exposure in our coursework, whether you're coming from a counseling profession, social work, psychology. We see this very medical model perspective, where the emphasis is on, again, impairment, deficit, pathology. It's not person-centered. And so thinking about that, some of the historical treatments, right, may have, under that medical model, may have been developed that were not person-centered, were not empowering. One of which right away we think about the historical lens of ABA therapy. ABA is applied behavioral analysis. This was pioneered in the 1960s as one of the first systematic interventions for individuals with autism. And there was this 1980 study that famously claimed that for individuals doing 40 hours per week of intensive ABA, right, if you were engaged in 40 hours, there was almost a 50% recovery rate achieved. And recovery to this particular study was that functioning was indistinguishable from peers without autism, right? So this was a shift, from this earlier view of how to support people with autism, but the shift was, right, that they were using punitive techniques, right, in this early approach to ABA, like electric shock, slaps, basically, these punitive measures to reduce unwanted behaviors. And so really what we saw in some of these early iterations of ABA was potential trauma responses, where individuals were experiencing, again, these punitive, Chris, I'm sorry, I'm just reading the chat. ABA account for masking behaviors. Absolutely. When we think about, the role of ABA, and this notion that kids are recovering, right? There's been a lot of scrutiny in terms of, recovering. Really, what people and what these like contemporary criticisms of ABA is that what we're helping people to do is we're emphasizing masking, right? And when we look at ABA therapy, right, this core criticism is that we're training individuals with autism or autistic individuals to mask their autism by suppressing natural behaviors, stimming behaviors like flapping or rocking, uncomfortable, distressing behaviors like avoiding eye contact or making eye contact in order to align with what people deem as neurotypical peers, right? So autistic individuals, adults, report that such camouflaging behavior comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to a person's mental health. Research on autistic masking finds that is often driven by stigma. These types of interventions, right, like ABA, and it can lead to negative outcomes, making autistic individuals who are masking feel exhausted, feel anxious, reports of loss of identity, or even increased suicidal ideation, right? So by rewarding children for not stimming or for forcing eye contact, ABA may inadvertently teach that someone's authentic self is not acceptable, compelling them to constantly, mask to appease others or to get that reward, right? And so autistic advocates have definitely spoke out in regards to ABA therapy. At times even aligning it or likening it, making it a comparison to conversion therapy for people who fall under gender expansive identities or affectional identities, varying affectional identities. And so we see in literature that there is a fair amount of information in regards to autistic burnout, right? Which many autistic adults link to prolonged masking and the intense pressure to meet societal expectations. Autistic burnout is characterized by chronic exhaustion, um, potential, loss of skills or disengagement with skills, maybe heightened sensory sensitivity after tremendous sustained effort to cope or fit in. Recent research defines autistic burnout really resulting from chronic life stress and mismatched expectations without adequate supports. When we think about autistic masking and burnout in the context of ABA, ABA is often provided for 20 to 40 hours per week. 20 to 40 hours per week of therapy. I can't even imagine as a child that chronic stress load. Right. So you hear, autistic adults saying that as a child, they endured hours of therapy to act neurotypical only to collapse, in private from the strain. Once the session ended, once the school day ended. And so that's something certainly to be mindful of. People may be coming into service, adults in your services that may experience trauma responses from this form of treatment. They may come in and have a lot of trauma in terms of betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma is when an individual experiences harm at the hands that are supposed to help, right? Harm at the hands that are supposed to help. And so this is certainly true for medical institutions. They may come into service and have challenges building a therapeutic alliance because of that betrayal trauma. So there is a lot of, thinking about like best practice and this piece about masking, right? There are many potential dangers of encouraging, teaching, or enforcing autistic people to mask or camouflage. It deprives people of their natural coping mechanisms and rest. And, from my perspective, as someone who works in trauma, it deprives people of their ability to regulate their autonomic nervous system in a way that feels good and right for them. So I do see some things coming in the chat. Yeah. All forms of ABA are detrimental to the person. And I'm trying to understand how these modalities are still used today. There is a lot of outspoken advocates in regards to the harm. I know there's been a lot of advocacy effort in terms of getting rid of ABA because again, we do see, I think it was like 46%, right? One survey that looked at autistic adults found that 46% of those respondents met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD after ABA therapy. It was a significantly higher rate for autistic individuals who had never received ABA therapy, right? So nearly half of people exposed to ABA therapy demonstrate clinical significant trauma symptoms. And so that's something that I think, we think about systems effects and treatment. us as practitioners, how are we undoing that system harm? How are we addressing in our efforts of advocacy, in our efforts of providing trauma-informed behavioral mental health services, right? How are we supporting these adults who may have inadvertently been harmed, by clinical services? And so when we think about, best practice, and how to conceptualize working with individuals, first and foremost, we have to really move away from this notion of a singular spectrum, and start thinking in terms of working with individuals in a multidimensional perspective and a person-centered approach. Right, so autism is often referred to as a spectrum, but the spectrum concept is misconceived as a single line from mild to severe. Advocates and researchers note that one-dimensional spectrum with labels like high functioning or low functioning, one can be stigmatizing and discriminatory and oversimplifies the reality of autism, right? So we want to move away from a linear perspective, and take a more, again, multidimensional approach. There are many different models of this autism wheel. This one, I believe I pulled off of I think it might have been a website that was linked through the NIH or SAMHSA. I can get that citation when I send out my materials. And this really looks at, again, this emerging perspective that there are various autistic traits in this multidimensional model, and that people can experience different degrees on each of these traits, right? So in this model, autism is represented by the different traits that you see along this wheel. We see things like communication, like speech, nonverbal communication, stimming, depression, and how each person that we're working with, each autistic individual, can have different levels of each one of these domains, each dimension. And so person may have strong strengths in a particular area, or they may have areas that are higher need, or need additional accommodation or support, right, from us, the practitioner, the provider, as well as additional individuals in their support system. And so I really like this wheel approach. It acknowledges that autism features a cluster in very heterogeneous ways, producing someone's unique spiky profile, right? It's often referred to as a spiky profile. And it really aligns with emerging research calling for a more dimensional description of ASD that is going to be more true in capturing variation across multiple domains rather than assigning a single global rating or ranking for overall general functioning. And I think when we use this multidimensional lens as clinicians, we can better understand the autistic person that we're working with and really leaning into their specific strengths. And again, learning more about the areas that they might like some additional support needs, accommodations, without resorting to stigmatizing labels or disempowering overly medical model services, right? It really, I think, provides a nuance for us to conceptualize the individual and their needs. And so when I think about moving away from that singular spectrum, I think about, really the work that's being done to bring not just awareness, but acceptance, right? And the Autistic Pride movement, right? So this is really a significant socio-political development within the autism community, emphasizing the value of autistic individuals and advocating, for that shift from viewing autism as a deficit to recognizing it as a natural variation. And we see that, again, the autistic pride movement and the neurodiversity movement are really aligned and I think have the same aim, to depathologize and to celebrate and empower individuals with autism or autistic individuals. And I think that goes hand in hand with this notion of helping people build positive disability identities. So when we think about disability identity, this is how much a person incorporates their disability into the context of their overarching identity and how they view that facet of their identity, whether they feel positive, empowered, and strong in terms of that disability identity. And so when we support a positive disability identity for individuals, we're working with autistic individuals, right? We're supporting improved self-esteem, self-efficacy, and overall, like, a strengthening in mental health and wellness. When we think about positive disability identity development, that encompasses or really incorporates self-acceptance, embracing one's autistic traits as integral parts of their identity. And then there is this piece on engaging, right, with the disability community. And so that's ways that we can strengthen a person's connection, an autistic person's connection, to the autistic community. And that plays a significant role in fostering a positive disability identity, by helping a person to feel connected to individuals who share similar pathways, similar experiences within the community, within that diagnosis. And that most people don't want to advocate for them. What I notice, disabled by society. What's up with the term disability? So there are varying perspectives on the use of the term disability and disabled. And often there is an overlap or connection with certain communities and the reclaiming and empowerment of disability identity. And we see that a lot in the autistic community. We see that as well in the capital D deaf community, where there is a positive disability identity. Disability is a piece of one's cultural lens. And so when we think about that, right, individuals can have cultural pride, right? Cultural pride in disability identity. And that's really what positive disability identity is, right? Having pride, empowerment, feeling self-efficacy, connection, community in that shared cultural facet. Great question. So when we think about developing that positive disability identity, we want to, one, be very mindful of how we are supporting individuals in connecting with their community, connecting with the autistic community, helping people to build a positive narrative associated with their diagnosis of autism, finding ways to feel empowered, strong, having agency, and one of the easiest ways that we can do that is through language. The use of language to describe individuals with autism spectrum disorder has really been a big topic of discussion within the autism community. Again, there are two primary approaches to language within this community, and that is identity first language and person first language. And each approach carries its own implications and preferences within the ASD community. And it's important for us practitioners, first and foremost, to respect a person's preferences. And we respect a person's preferences by matching their language and inquiring about their preferred language, right? If you take anything away from today, definitely, respect a person's preferred language approach. So again, identity first language prioritizes the identity itself, placing the identity before the person, right? So autistic person rather than person with autism. And advocates of identity first language argue that it acknowledges and validates that the individual's identity and that piece of autism is integral to who they are. It emphasizes acceptance and pride in one's identity rather than viewing the condition as separate or undesirable or something shameful or something that is mirroring, right, that medical model notion of pathology or impairment. Many individuals and advocacy groups within the neurodiversity movement, again, where they're trying to seek and promote acceptance and appreciation of neurological differences, prefer identity first language, right? So you may hear someone say, I am an autistic person. They're using identity first language, and you can certainly inquire, like, what in terms of language preferences, I hear you using identity first language, right? You can inquire to confirm, but certainly mirror what that person's using. Then we have person first language. Person first language places the person before the condition, emphasizing the individual as a person first and foremost. And so in this approach, you'd hear person with autism rather than autistic person. And proponents of person first language argue that this language prioritizes the individual's humanity and respect for their autonomy and dignity. They believe that separating the person from the condition reduces stigma, promotes inclusivity and acceptance. And so the best approach, I know I have my preference. I know my son has his preference. I know, folks that I'm working with have their preferences. And that's point A, respect individual preferences. Recognize a person's language preference, and it could vary from your own. But we always want to honor the person that we're working with and mirror their language. And we do that by inquiring about their preferred language, avoid making assumptions about their language. And if you use the wrong approach, right, apologize, make that repair. My apologies. I just use person first language. I'm making a note, and definitely moving forward, we'll be honoring that identity first language in our work together, right? Just building that repair up, letting the person know that you're identifying what you did and that you are making an effort, right, to correct that moving forward. And so when we think about working with individuals within the ASD community, we want to be mindful of these common comorbidities. Mental health conditions, as you know, are broad ranges of conditions that affect people, the way they think, feel. Mental health conditions affect mood, behavior. We know that these conditions can be cyclical, that things can wax and wane in terms of symptoms, symptom duration or severity, and how it impacts someone in their roles and environment. We know that mental health conditions are also diagnosed based on the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, using the DSM-5. When we think about mental health conditions, overall, right, in the United States, based on the NIH's work, we see that nearly 20% of adults will experience a mental health condition in any given year. And about half of all individuals will meet the criteria for a mental health condition at some point during the lifetime, right? So 50% of people will meet DSM-5 criteria for a mental health condition within their lifetime. That's not to say that they will always meet that criteria, right? They can meet the criteria and then later on no longer be meeting that diagnostic eligibility criteria. Just means that overall 50% of folks will at some point or another meet criteria. When we think about prevalence of comorbidity, it's important for us to know that autistic individuals are likely to experience a higher prevalence of mental health conditions when compared to non-autistic individuals. It's estimated that nearly 70% of people with autism experience at least one comorbid mental health condition. And then nearly 40% of individuals with autism or autistic individuals may have 2 or more mental health conditions. So we see a high prevalence of comorbidity in terms of the breakdown. Prevalence and overlap of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. We see a 2019 meta-analysis found roughly 9% of individuals with ASD had OCD. Other studies indicated rates as even high as 22%, right? 22% of individuals with autism, autistic adults had OCD. And so we want to be mindful when we see individuals with OCD, right? They can have repetitive behaviors, compulsions, and some of these things can also align with autism. And so that really makes differential diagnosis challenging. I think clinicians really have to be discerning when assessing individuals and being mindful that behaviors can overlap. So we want to be on the lookout for that. Sometimes there might even be overdiagnoses because of a lack of understanding, right? Thinking about prevalence for other mental health conditions, depression is one of the most common co-occurring mental health conditions for autistic adults. In a large meta-analysis published in 2022, we see 11% prevalence of depressive disorders for autistic adults. In other clinical samples and other studies, we see as high as 30% of individuals with autism, autistic adults, having a diagnosis of depression. And so we want to be, mindful that, and that's, I should say, that's much higher than non-autistic adults, where there's like a 7% prevalence per year, right? So whether we're looking at the one study of 11% or the top end of that stat of 30%, it's still staggeringly higher than non-autistic adults. We want to be mindful too in terms of conditions like bipolar disorder. There is less, this is less common than anxiety and depression, but for autistic adults, we do see an elevated rate relative to the general population. We see, I think it was a 2019 review that found that 5% of individuals with ASD had co-occurring bipolar disorder. We also know that there are some bit of contradicting studies when it comes to substance use disorder and prevalence. We see some large-scale reports that suggest relatively low rates of diagnosed substance use disorder in the autism community. I know one study cited approximately 2% prevalence of alcohol use disorder. whereas another self-selected sample study found much higher rates, up to 19 to 30% in some clinical settings. So we want to be mindful, in terms of substance use disorders as well as PTSD. I mentioned earlier, autistic adults have markedly elevated risk for trauma exposure and PTSD. We see, high rates, roughly, up to 45% of autistic individuals meeting criteria for probable clinical PTSD. In one survey in 2022, over 60% of people screened with autism met criteria for PTSD. We know in terms of risk factors, we see things, we mentioned the ABA therapy. There's also things like bullying, harassment, abuse that could be coming up, social isolation, right? That may have come up for folks during childhood. And so we want to be mindful of potential comorbidity of PTSD diagnosis, or at the very least, some subclinical PTSD trauma responses when we're working with folks. And then we also see a very high suicidality rate, right? When we look at a 2023 meta-analysis, this was pooled data from tens of thousands of autistic individuals, and they found about 34% had ever experienced suicidal ideation, with 24% had attempted suicide or engaged in suicidal behaviors. And so we see, again, at risk, especially for autistic adults, in terms of suicidal ideation. And when we think about these comorbidities, what really comes to mind for me is how are people able to, with compromised wellness, right? Especially my role as a rehabilitation counselor, helping people to identify aspirations in terms of goals of their passions, right? The things that they want to do that make life meaningful, whether that's having partners or going to school for a passion, right? So I'm always curious, like, what does this mean for meaningful life roles? Included in those meaningful life roles are student and worker, right? How is that person able to do the things that they want to do, right? If they do want to go to school, if they do want to go to work, how are they able to engage in those things when we're seeing such profound barriers in terms of health and wellness trauma, right? And what do we see in these domains? Individuals are reporting many challenges, especially in that transition to adulthood. We see only 36% of young adults who identify as autistic ever attended any post-secondary education by their early 20s. And this was a report that was put out by, I think it was Drexel University. And this is half the rate of the general population, right? So about 66% of high school grads enroll in some college. And we only see that mirrored in 36% of autistic young adults. So there is a substantial gap, right, in higher education in terms of individuals accessing higher education. And then we also see that employment rates are similarly low. About 58% of young adults with autism had paid employment outside of the home at any point between high school and their early 20s. And those who did find jobs, they were working part-time in low-wage positions. They held jobs that often didn't yield financial self-sufficiency, or they were underemployed, right? Those jobs didn't match their skills, their interests, their preferences. And so these figures really show that a large portion of autistic adults have challenges successfully transitioning to post-secondary education to work. In fact, over 1/3 of those young adults, around 37%, were found to be completely disconnected in their early 20s to employment or education. And so we see some barriers that are coming up for folks. Yeah, Anna, that's a great question. What does this data actually look like in terms of people who are undiagnosed, or individuals, yeah, yeah, absolutely, who might not be reporting, um, maybe even because of that stigma. Um, so we know that there are challenges that are barriers, systemic, system-wide barriers for people. In this study by, I'm going to botch this name. Oh, excuse me one second. I'm getting a message to update something on my computer. I'm so sorry. Um, from Shremby et al., we see that there are 3 categories of barriers for individuals with autism spectrum disorder in post-secondary ed. And those categories included intrapersonal barriers, right? This was category 1, where autistic students, post-secondary students, felt that challenges with flexibility, abstract thinking, sensory processing, attention, recall, right? Things that were, some of those things are executive functioning skills. Some have to do with the environment and the setting, right? These barriers really impacted their academic wellness, as well as how they were connecting socially, that this area of interpersonal concerns was a significant issue with maintaining matriculation and passing classes. Then there were interpersonal barriers. Autistic students were reporting significant challenges in interpersonal interactions, affecting personal and working relationships, difficulties in making and maintaining personal relationships were a common theme, which is really echoed in some additional previous research. We see systems concerns, right? Which is barriers with the institution that autistic students faced. And this could be things like long wait times for services, inadequate support, was often highlighted in the study, right? Reflecting really a broader problem of institutional unpreparedness in meeting the needs of autistic students. Then we also saw this piece of how these barriers interacted with one another, right? That there was this interactive and hierarchical nature where these barriers experienced by autistic students kind of intertwined and intersected. And that made challenges significantly harder. And so when we think about supports, the second study by Sheaf et al. Found that there were 3 themes in helping students in the college setting, autistic students who are in that post-secondary ed setting. And these themes that emerged was 1, individualized services. Services had to be tailored to a student's needs, including educational coaching, guidance, personal planning meetings, and advocacy to address those systems issues. Second, was this intervention that they refer to as a place to call home. Students who, college students with autism identified that they wanted to have access to an office, to a space, to a place that was safe on campus, whether it was a workspace, someone's, library space, just some place that they were comfortable, that they knew that they could go to decompress, where they could feel comfort and they could regulate, right, in whatever way they needed to. And that was called a place to call home, a landing space, so to speak, where they felt safe. And then the third category of support that made the difference, in addition to individual services and a place to call home, was support outside the program, right? Where they received accommodations from disability services, tutoring, and tutoring tailored to their unique learning needs. Additionally, getting things like assistance with academic skill development, especially things like executive functioning, which we're going to talk about in a second. And again, this domain of employment, we see that individuals who identify as autistic are reporting that they're less likely to be employed, with some studies noting that approximately 15% of individuals diagnosed with autism gain employment, right? Access and maintain employment. And so when I think about that, when I think about students who are having challenges with maintaining matriculation, getting to cap and gown, graduating, I think about their challenge in getting credentials to enter employment and their limited employment opportunities, which really speak to diminished social determinants of health. The World Health Organization describes the social determinants of health as societal factors that contribute to 50% of health and wellness. And those factors include employment status, education a person has obtained, the community a person resides in, their social networks, how they connect with people in the community, right? The food that they have access to, and the healthcare that they also have access to. And so the key core social determinants of health really are education and employment. Education helps you to obtain employment that supports your financial wellness, your financial autonomy, and then your job and that economic stability ultimately helps you to access housing, to access healthcare, to access good quality food, especially if you reside in places like food deserts, where healthy food can be really, really, really expensive. And so when we think about autistic adults who are experiencing challenges with education in post-secondary ed and employment, what we're really talking about is this systemic issue of inequity of those social determinants of health, right? If people are not supported in their education and employment opportunities, right, then that could mean a lifelong diminished social determinants of health, right? Being in a lower income bracket, or just experiencing like further inequity. And so thinking about the services that we can offer, the supports that we can engage in to mitigate these systems issues, we can look at and explore, right, addressing these specific types of supports. One, bolstering natural supports, that's friends, families, and coworkers, community supports and their access to community supports, formal supports, which falls in line with what we do. But especially in the domain of education and employment is this piece on accommodations and assistive technology. But all of this has to be done in a person-centered and strength-based approach, right? A cornerstone of best practice is to provide service to autistic individuals as they being the expert in their own experience and tailoring our services to meet their unique spiky profile right? And so in practical terms, this means being person-centered, listening to their goals, respecting communication differences, collaboratively developing um, goal plans, looking at what their strengths are, and seeing areas of need and developing services to meet those needs within the context of these different supports that we can link people to. Um, and so thinking about, oh, I see something in the chat. Another helpful practice my team is taking up is displaying feeling cards of different colors, allowing team members to recognize how a person is best to be interacted with at that time. I love that, Chris. That's great. I like to use the red light, yellow light, green light, where I guess it's like a similar preference. Green is like feeling good, ready to go. Yellow is, have some hesitancy, something's going on. Red is like full stop, really struggling today, need to talk about potential X, Y, or Z. I love how you are bringing different approaches into your service to meet a person's communication needs. Um, and again, making that a part of your team's process, and supporting people and their unique needs. Absolutely. So thinking about this piece about accommodations, um, I think it's important, right? Often this is an area that's overlooked. Um, People coming from the secondary education setting may have frequently had their parents, their guardians, other people represent them in IEP meetings. They might not have been a part of those meetings. They might not know what their accommodations were or modifications in secondary education. They may not know the process and what they're legally entitled to. And so I think this is a great part of our service provision and letting people know what their civil rights are, what they are legally able to access, and how these things can support, different aspirations that they may have, especially in that context of those social determinants of health. And so the ADA, as it stands, knock on wood, is still an active piece of legislation called the Americans with Disability Act, and it plays a critical role in protecting individuals with autism against discrimination and ensuring that that autistic adults have their right to accommodations and to be free of discrimination in employment and educational settings. So please familiarize yourself with, this piece of the ADA and accommodations. Reasonable accommodations, again, is the modification or adjustment to a job, the work environment, the educational setting, or the way things are usually done, right? How things get completed. Oftentimes, people struggle to develop accommodations for non-apparent disabilities, for mental health conditions, for autism, right? Practitioners, ODS, they can be really good at providing accommodations for people with mobility issues, with um, hearing impairment, or people who are experiencing a visual impairment. But for folks that have non-apparent health conditions like autism, like even like multiple sclerosis, right? They struggle. They don't know what to do. And so we really have to educate ourselves in what this means and how to tailor accommodations for folks to thrive in whatever role and domain they want to engage in. When I say domain, I mean our living domains, are our life domains, which is living where we live, working, learning, and social, right? However people want to engage in those things. And why do I say however they want to? It's person-centered. We're letting people choose what their aspirations are, and we are supporting them, right, in their life goals as they traverse services. And so thinking about accommodations, we see that a lot of people identify, right? Autistic adults report that accommodations are really assistive in that they help people to maintain employment, to experience higher success on the job. And yet people can be really reluctant to inquire about accommodations. They might not know what accommodations are accessible to them. They may not even know that the ADA covers, right, autistic individuals or individuals with mental health conditions. And again, so that really underscores our need to build our expertise in this area as practitioners. Oftentimes, employers cite the concern about accommodations as being cost prohibitive, but the data really suggests, and this was a 2020 survey conducted by the Job Accommodations Network. That acronym is JAN. I'm going to put that into the chat. In fact, I'm going to put in the chat the specific page for autism. So JAN is a federally funded program that meets with virtually via phone, via chat bot, providers, individuals with disabilities, employers, and or school representatives to determine what accommodations can be most effective for a disability. And so this page that I just put into the chat is Jan's page on autism. And what are the particular functional implications of autism and how those functional implications can be offset by an accommodation, by a tailored, intentional accommodation. I have used this resource. In fact, am having my students that I'm teaching this semester use this resource in a paper that they're writing, where they have case vignettes and they're calling Jan and asking about accommodations and what accommodations could be developed. They meet with you for free. They will meet with the person in your service. They will meet with an employer. They are going to provide sample accommodation letters. If you have a person that you're working with who is autistic and they're struggling with aspirations related to, work or school, Jan is a excellent free resource. And they list sample accommodations that include things like changes in schedule, right? $0 for a change in schedule, extra breaks, telework, or, zooming into class, written instructions, checklists, visual aids like you guys are talking about in the chat, color-coded aids, headphones, noise canceling headphones, having a job coach or educational coach on site, that is an approved accommodation. Memory cues, such as labeling or color coding, smart pens, love the smart pens, or the AI bots that can record and do notation. Talks to text dictation is amazing. I think Dragon dictation software is one of them that help folks to be able to, and this was like great for students that I was working with when they were writing papers. They were able to use that Dragon dictation software so that they could, speak, and then that would show up on the screen. And that changed the trajectory for some people, their academic performance and their satisfaction with their academic experience. A big part of accommodations can be assistive technology. AT, or assistive technology, adaptive technology, refers to a broad range of low-tech and high-tech devices, software, or equipment that is specifically designed to support individuals in their daily life activities, in education, work, personal life, right, to offset a functional implication of a health condition. And AT aims to, again, mitigate the functional implication by enhancing accessibility, giving people access to environments and removing barriers, right, in the environment, or that the environment creates in regards to that health condition. AT can play a crucial role in helping people to be successful in the academic environment and the work environment. And AT can really, I think, be successful, but also low cost or no cost. Oftentimes, we can get things reimbursed from organizations like the VR services, vocational rehabilitation services, or the school itself, or the employer. Right? So it's a very financially feasible support that is underutilized, right? Accommodations and AT for individuals with autism are frequently underutilized, but again, a civil right, right? This is the rights issue and helping to take out the barriers in that environment. When we think about assistive technology and accommodations, it's really a process. And when we say it's a process of finding out what works well for a person, and checking in periodically to see how they're doing with that assistive technology, because up to 50% of assistive technology can be abandoned by a person. So we really want to help a person to determine what would be helpful, to have them use it, and to check in frequently to see if that piece of assistive technology is helping to mitigate the barriers that they're experiencing in that environment. Types of assistive technology can include, I said, low-tech solutions, paper-based tools. That can be simple as like planners, calendars, physical journals, to help autistic students or workers to stay organized, manage schedules. It could be stress balls, fidget tools. It could be, things like high-tech solutions, relaxation apps, digital note-taking software, or even like task management apps, like task lists and reminders. I mentioned text to speech and speech to text software. All of these tools can really be assistive in mitigating environmental barriers that bar people from being successful in the domain of work or school, in their personal life, socializing, or residing in their community. So thinking about that process and determining what piece of assistive technology is helpful or what accommodation is helpful, we really want to use our good counseling approaches, our good mental health, behavioral health approaches to supporting this process. Right, so that would look like helping to learn more about the functional implication of the health condition. The functional implication is just a fancy way of saying, how does having a mental health condition, or how is being autistic impacting your engagement in the environment? Or how, another way to say that is, how is the environment intersecting, right, with your diagnosis of or the presence of a mental health condition or being autistic? And so I have a worksheet for everyone to further explore with folks how to complete this process. You'll get this handout in addition to the PowerPoint after the session today emailed, but this is a tool that you can use in conjunction with Jan to determine in your clinical services and the work that you do, how can I help people to access accommodations? And so we see in the far left-hand column, name of the health condition. So that we might put here autism. We might list under the symptom or the experience, sensitivity to sensory input. And then that implication might be that sensory sensitivity affects ability to concentrate, or the environment is so noisy, it's impacting that sensory sensitivity. And then we want to look to Jan to see what is a possible accommodation. What is a possible accommodation to help with that sensory sensitivity. That could be noise canceling headphones. That could be having that person have a different seating arrangement, right? Moving that seat to a different area in the classroom or in the workspace, right? Another example might be this piece about executive functioning, right? So challenges with time management, and the functional implication could be that the person has challenges with initiating assignments or initiating work tasks, and a possible accommodation might be that they can submit things on a more frequent basis to have feedback, so that there's multiple deadlines for that person instead of one, right? To get that feedback and to get support in submitting that larger task and managing that time. So thinking about this, I think we passed this a moment ago. My apologies. What we're really looking at in some of these like key areas is this piece on executive functioning, right? Executive functioning really is a fancy way of saying the higher level cognitive processes that we all use throughout the day to engage in our um, various goals, our roles, whether it's working, socializing, living in our homes. We require to leverage these executive functioning skills. These things, again, higher level cognitive processing, things like time management, organization, planning, um, emotional regulation. That's a big part of executive functioning. Um, Looking at things like procrastination, task initiation, right? All of these things are housed in this prefrontal cortex of our brain, and frequently those things are impacted with mental health conditions, with individuals identifying under that neurodiverse umbrella, and autistic adults, especially things like ADHD, right? We see a, a change in those pieces of executive functioning. And so we want to be very mindful when we are doing our good work in the community. How are we helping people to build things like compensatory strategies? Compensatory strategies are approaches that we can leverage to support people with executive functioning. So if you've ever utilized a timer, if you ever set a timer, that's a compensatory strategy. If you ever wrote a to-do list, that's a compensatory strategy, right? To help you remember, to help you recall, um, to set that reminder. If you ever utilized a somatic skill exercise, right, for emotional regulation, that can be considered a compensatory strategy. So again, when we think about the things that we want to support people with in the domains of going to school, going to work, residing in their home, socializing, right? When we think about all of those good aspirations that autistic adults or transition age youth might have, executive functioning support can be a key piece of that work. And it's often overlooked, especially by practitioners in the behavioral and mental health setting. Oftentimes it's left to private practitioners that few people have access to. Right, these like private executive functioning coaches. So we can do some good hands-on work in this domain by using different assessments, like the one that I shared, to kind of help consider like what are the, again, those functional implications of experiencing, right, that health condition, whether it's specific to autism or even a mental health condition. So we are just about at time. I am going to go back to that worksheet, but I'm going to open up for questions, and I will hit the pause button while we do our questions.